I want to be super clear on this point because I've been doing some of these podcasts and I want to make sure that nobody leaves this podcast feeling like perfectionism is evil or perfectionists are evil. It comes with a lot of great qualities. Honesty, tend to be a bit more honest than other people, maybe because of that moral component. They tend to be a little bit more loyal. When they believe in something, if they believe in the company or they believe in your leadership, they will be the most loyal person on your team. They tend to be extremely detailed oriented. And I'm a firm believer that you need a variety of people on a team for big picture to detailed oriented. They tend to be your hardest working.
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. In today's hyper-competitive world, pursuing perfectionism can seem like a commendable goal, yet the drive for this flawless execution in everything from personal milestones to professional tasks can really take a hefty toll on us. So why do we still chase this illusion of perfection despite knowing that we are innately imperfect beings? Perfectionism isn't just sort of a casual descriptor, it's a complex psychological paradigm that many of us sort of unwittingly embrace, whether it's hosting the perfect dinner party or nailing this critical presentation or even proposing marriage. The quest for perfection can be both exhilarating and absolutely exhausting. These are the questions we'll be unraveling in the next two episodes of the Dov Baron Show, so come for the stories. Stay for the learning. Tap into our community of deeply curious learners by subscribing today. This isn't just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Every episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. So, what is it that compels us to present this flawless facade? Is it merely a societal pressure, or is it something more deeply ingrained in our psyche? More importantly, how can we strive for excellence without self-flagellation, without beating the crap out of ourselves when we fail? How do we get over these idealized standards? Joining us for a revealing two-part series is Dr. Greg Chasson, a noted perfectionism and fear of failure expert, with his profound insights from his latest book called Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management, for leadership, for you, for me, for all of us. Dr. Chasson is an award-winning author, clinical psychologist, associate professor at the University of Chicago. He directs the Behavioral Intervention for Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders program, making him uniquely qualified to dissect the nuances of perfectionism that pervade our daily lives. So let's dive into understanding our desire for perfectionism, understand its roots, and learn how to balance our aspirations with this overwhelming desire for perfection. So turn up the volume and help me to welcome author of Flawless, Dr. Greg Chasson. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It is absolutely my pleasure, mate. Now, I always like to start with this point, and that is nobody starts off where they end up. And a lot of the time we kind of think that when we say, oh, this guy's an expert. He's from the University of Chicago. But there's a backstory, and the backstory is what we call the emotional source code. It probably started in your childhood that had you end up in this direction. What's the emotional source code that gives us the context for who you are and what it is you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really does develop over a long period of time. You don't write a book about perfectionism without having some intimate experience with it.
Really?
Oh, yeah, shocker. And so I would say that growing up, it was a bit of a perfectionistic journey for me. And I think it was more about feeling judged by other people and being seen as an imposter. And I think we'll have some discussion today about the link between imposter syndrome and perfectionism. And I think that's where I really started, to be honest with you, was this idea that I had to put on a show for everyone around me. And it felt disingenuous for sure, but it felt necessary in this very complex social world that we're in. And I think over time, I just felt so inauthentic that I felt there had to be a better way.
So did you have an awareness of this desire to present? By that, I mean to present this facade, even as a kid?
I would say that not only did I have awareness, I took pride in it. I thought that I could be that person that didn't have a single person not like them.
Oh,
which is impossible, right?
Well, I have a quote, and my quote is, if your commitment is to be liked by everyone, you will never be loved by anyone because no one will ever know you.
Yeah, I wish I had known that when I was a kid because that quote echoes true. But it took a while for me to learn that. I would say I was probably in my mid-20s when it finally clicked. Maybe that's when my frontal lobe finally finished developing, and I said to myself, "I can't, this is impossible. What am I doing? Follow other values. You're not gonna be able to please everyone."
So tell me, because I am really fascinated by this, was there a moment, was there something, was there a slap upside the head that made you go, what the fuck am I doing here? This is crazy.
There was somebody that I really trusted in my life, in my training, that ended up doing some pretty egregious things that I don't want to get into because that person may be listening. But the bottom line is it shattered my sort of trust in the people that were supposed to shape my training and my life. And I think it made me take a step back and ask, what's the point of all this? And that existential moment, I think, is then what working backwards made me think, how did I get here? And where do I want to go from here? And it really did take 20 some odd years for me to get there.
Yeah, I can see that. It's fascinating to me because I know we're going to get into the details of perfectionism, but one of the things about perfectionism that I know from my training originally as a therapist was that the perfectionist is often driven by the inner idea that everybody else or someone else is perfect and I'm not as good as them. So it's like, well, I've got to be perfect because they're perfect, which definitely goes back to that childlike part of us where we've deified the parents. Mom and dad are God and goddess, they're perfect. And so I've got to be perfect in order to be loved. If we don't develop out of that, which I think is a psychological block, if we've not evolved past that psychologically, then it's very easy for this to sort of come into us. Do you want to add to that, or am I whacked on this?
No, definitely not whacked. I actually think that you're spot on with a little bit more even added to the story, and that we're getting bombarded with these messages, not just from parents or even our perception of perfect parents, but we're getting it from school, from teachers, from magazines, and social media is absolutely at the top of the list. And as good as some of these things are for our development and for society and advancement, they also come with some of these negatives. And I think perfectionistic mentalities are a part of that.
Let's sort of break it down for everybody. How do you define perfectionism? What is perfectionism at its basic way of being?
Yeah. So perfectionism is essentially defined by, in my mind, by two main characteristics. And it's not just expectations or high achievement. It's actually two things that are unrelated to the quality of your work in a lot of ways. You don't need to sacrifice high expectations in order to not be a perfectionist. And not everyone knows that. But the two features are rigidity and excessive expectations. Excessive expectations, in my mind alone, is not sufficient for being a major problem. You think of the Kobe Bryants of the world, you think of the presidents of the world. These people have high expectations. The difference is the rigidity. They're flexible. And so when something doesn't quite go as planned, or if something is deemed impossible, people are able to pivot. They're not stuck on this path and being unable to move or sway to something different. The people with perfectionism have the inability to change their mindset. And I think that is the hallmark feature, is this rigidity. And the excessive expectations does play a role, because if you think about it, if you have this ridiculously high expectation and you're unwilling to pivot, you're going to be in for a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, because most things in life require that adaptability, and perfectionists really struggle with that.
That's really important. Wow, what a great point. This rigidity. I think that that's something that most people give themselves permission to continue to be perfect without understanding that they're running up against the wall when the door's to the left. It's like, well, eventually I'm going to make it through the wall. Yeah, you might die in the process. Like, the wall might come down, but so might you. And that rigidity, that's a very important thing. There's that side of it, and then there's this expectations piece, which you talked about. It's interesting to me because I look at that in the context of, if you're a leader, relationally. If you are a perfectionist relationally, and that means leading, if you're a perfectionist doing the same rigid thing over and over, you're also going to put those expectations on others. So you are never going to be able to connect with people because they're never going to be able to meet your crazy ass standards that just keep seeming to be the brass ring nobody can ever reach, and get shut down in the process.
100%. You have nailed it. This is what I talk to organizations about when I talk to them. This is what I give programs on, is that this perfectionism isn't just a me problem or an individual issue. It does radiate outwards. And there's a form of perfectionism called other-oriented perfectionism, where you are projecting these standards in a rigid way onto other people. And when this happens in a workplace, it can be extremely toxic. And I actually think it's the most toxic when that perfectionistic standard is based around morals, this moralism. So when you hold other people to extremely rigid moral standards, your behavior and the approach and the sort of atmosphere that you give off is a bit self-righteous. And so you have this aura of policing the environment. And as a leader, sometimes that's your prerogative. You can do that. But I think too much of that and it turns people off. It feels very uncomfortable.
So talk to us more about this moral policing. That's a fascinating subject around perfectionism, particularly in the political environment we're in, where people are claiming certain things are, quote, Christian. And anybody who's ever studied Christianity, as in the text, would discover that there was this bloke who lived in that area of the Middle East at that time who seemed to me to be pretty lacking in judgment, pretty free from judgment. And yet all of that is around this moral righteousness. So talk to us about how somebody gets caught in that loop. And we can go into this from a psychological, even a neuroscientific level, because I think it's really important for people to understand that this is something that you take on and then it's a beast you feed.
Absolutely. It starts with even just thinking about an example. When you have a manager who becomes extremely fixated on their employees getting to work on time, and so they show up on time at 7 o'clock, but every now and then they show up at 7:02. And I've seen this. I have a patient in my clinic who was on the verge of being terminated for being 1 minute late. 1 minute. And I'm not saying that tardiness is okay, but I'm saying is that there needs to be some flexibility and some room for circumstances and context. And this person had it, right? He just wasn't asked about it and was just assumed that he was being disrespectful of the manager's time. But getting stuck on a rule like that at the expense of the underlying principles is a real problem. The rule behind being on to work on time is to be productive, to have an environment where there's fairness and balance, and to essentially make the service and the customers go like gangbusters. But when you send people home or you get on their case or you create this toxic environment, you're undermining the entire point of those rules in the first place. And this happens all the time in the workplace. I think people don't see that. It could come across in a very sanctimonious way. If you're policing people coming in at 7:01, no one wants to stick around for that kind of environment.
There's a challenge here. And one of the things I would say to leaders is this, and I do this when I go in to do corporate work, your people are not going to tell you the truth. And people are like, well, my people do. No, they're not. For one simple reason, their mortgage, their kids' school, their lease on their account, all depends on you. So their number one job is to keep you happy. So they're not going to tell you, listen, you're an asshole and you're so rigid, it's ridiculous, right? They're not going to tell you that. And the problem with that is that many leaders are not particularly self-aware. So what's the bridge there, Greg? Because they're not going to tell me, and I am not aware that I'm being this rigid asshole who it's impossible to work for. What's the awakening? What's the slap upside the head that gets them to go, oh, besides talking to you or me?
Right. Yeah. Go get my book. It is a good question. Self-awareness. I mean, how do you know what you don't know? It's always a good question. And I think looking for red flags. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're wondering if this is you, I think that's already a huge step. And then taking some measure of, do I find that there's a higher than usual level of turnover? Do I find that people are giving me really lame or inconsistent reasons for leaving? Does it feel like they're just putting on a show for me and not really trying to establish mastery or purpose towards the organization's mission and what they're doing? Does it seem like they're just following marching orders instead of contributing in a deeper way? And then looking for other basic red flags, some of which I go through in my book of perfectionism, that includes things like reassurance seeking, or from a boss's perspective, reverse reassurance seeking, which is one of the most bizarre things. This is where a boss goes up to their employees and says, how did I do as a boss? Which is fine to get feedback, But if it's done constantly or excessively, it really undermines that level of confidence that your employees might have in you. So I think it's okay to check in about feedback. I just think you need to be able to do it in a Goldilocks kind of way rather than being constantly pressuring your employees to get a sense of that validation that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
So how does perfectionism, or this mindset of perfectionism, how does that impact the bigger picture, i.e. innovation or such?
Yeah. So perfectionism, I want to be super clear on this point because I've been doing some of these podcasts and I want to make sure that nobody leaves this podcast feeling like perfectionism is evil or perfectionists are evil. It comes with a lot of great qualities. Honesty, tend to be a bit more honest than other people, maybe because of that moral component. They tend to be a little bit more loyal. When they believe in something, if they believe in the company or they believe in your leadership, they will be the most loyal person on your team. They tend to be extremely detailed oriented. And I'm a firm believer that you need a variety of people on a team from big picture to detailed oriented. They tend to be your hardest working. They've been tripling down on everything since they were a kid. So they're going to triple down on everything continuously, and you're going to benefit from that. And the most correlated ingredients from the research literature with perfectionism is conscientiousness. If I had one ingredient I wanted to pick in my employees, I think it would be that thoughtfulness and being in the moment and conscientious to what needs to be done. But that being said, perfectionism can create an extremely problematic work environment, and it can lead to a lot of personal problematic behaviors as well as team-based or organizational-based problems.
Can you talk to us about those? Talk to us about those problems that are likely to show up.
Yeah.
Because this is going to help the leader to maybe recognize, oh, yeah, that's a red flag. That shows up. I didn't know until Greg mentioned it, but it's like, oh, yeah, we have that.
Absolutely. So at the individual level, red flag, people who are procrastinating like crazy. Now, procrastination is not uncommon. We've all done it. The problem is when it becomes excessive, and if you can determine that it's fear-based, what's causing this procrastination? So what's the function? That's what I tell my trainees. Function. What is the purpose of this procrastination? Is it because you're trying to get something to feel just right? What we call NJRS, not just right feelings. Are we trying to get things perfect? Are we trying to make sure it's correct? And are we worried about making a mistake? Are we trying to predict what we think our supervisor is looking for and then continuously erase and start over? These are the kinds of things that lead to procrastination. And I would say a good chunk of the time, it's perfectionism at the core.
Wow. See, I wouldn't have thought of that as related, procrastination, perfectionism, but I can see it. It makes perfect sense, right? I'm going to put it off because if I can't do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it at all. So I'm just going to keep putting it off.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's a bit of a paradox. You have perfectionists who will turn in the best work you've ever seen in your life, often late because they've been spending so much time on it and they don't hit deadlines very well, but it's the most beautiful work you've ever seen. Or they just never turn it in ever. Rarely there's a middle ground.
Right. It's one extreme or the other.
Exactly.
So from that sort of point of view, when we come to this, you talked about this right at the very beginning, which is this imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I mean, more than 70% of executives have some level of imposter syndrome. And I think that as you get moved into the next level of something, there's going to be a level. I personally think, and you can certainly give me your feedback on it, I think there's some very good things about imposter syndrome. I know I had it very severely, and it drove me to be a great learner. It drove me to become a master of my art or whatever it was. And as a polymath, that meant I was going so deep on so many things that I wanted to understand. But I know that it was driven by that imposter syndrome thing, which I didn't want to look like an idiot who didn't know what he was doing. But the overshadow of that and perfectionism, talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I loved what you just said about the rising to the next level, instigating another episode of imposter syndrome, because I actually say the same thing to my trainees. We generally get to this weird stage model where we are feeling more and more confident until we get moved to the next step. And then we plummet in our confidence and we start to have that imposter syndrome again. I think it's a really important insight that you just brought up. And I think we see perfectionism interact with that in such a negative way. I really truly believe that it never goes away. Even for the people that are feeling more and more confident, there's always a little element, a little component of you that still feels like, what am I? How did I get here? Why do they listen to me? I'll sit in this podcast right now and wonder, like, how am I here right now? This is the way it goes. I actually tell my trainees this. I'm always a bit skeptical of the person that doesn't have imposter syndrome, to be honest with you.
Yeah, they may be narcissistic.
Maybe so.
It's like, I have no imposter syndrome. Oh, I'm worried about you.
Yeah. Or it's bullshit. One of the two.
Exactly. Well, there's also that. Well, even with narcissism, it's bullshit to some degree. I know that you're part of neuroscientific studies in psychology and all the rest of it. Is there a neuroscience to perfectionism? Does it have a neurochemical sequence that you're aware of?
Yes, there are neuroscientific studies on perfectionism. It is a very, very thin literature, to be honest with you. And so there aren't many conclusions that can be drawn. I would suggest, if for those that are interested in this, looking at just anxiety or fear-based neurocircuitry more generally. And I say those as if they're the same, but it's very complicated. You have sort of future-based worry versus immediate threat-based fear, and the different circuits involved in terms of the emotion centers of the brain and the prefrontal cortex. The short answer is yes, there's some evidence that this perfectionism is both genetically based, if you're looking at the biological underpinnings, but also that there are patterns in the brain that look awfully similar to what you would see in most anxiety patterns and avoidance-based learning patterns.
I certainly have a degree of belief in genetics, but a much greater degree in epigenetics. In the environment has created the thing. And whether that's the epigenetic of the environment being the cell holding the DNA, or whether it's the human being in the environment we grow up in. And I think that environment, as with any environment, can create a polarized response, meaning you can grow up in an environment where parents don't give a crap and they don't do anything, and you end up growing up to be somebody who never achieves anything. And by the same means, your sibling is a perfectionist who's achieving the highest possible things. That's a polar response to an original environment. But it's interesting for me that the neural pathways become so deeply embedded because we repeat the cycle over and over again. And so we create this version of an addiction that is a neurochemical cocktail that is repeated over and over again, that creates receptors on the cells that says, give me more perfection, meaning give me that cocktail. It's self-perpetuating.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you're spot on when it comes to this habitual nature of this. And you call it addiction. And I think you could even say that this behavioral addiction falls right into that category. And what you're describing maps on to parts of the brain called the striatum, which really is about the habit formation. And once we've gotten so ingrained in our perfectionistic tendencies, as probably as children, based on the environment that we're in, this neurocircuitry becomes more and more ingrained and burned into our sort of utilization and overuse, and it becomes second nature and habitual. We're not even recognizing it so much anymore, and this makes it particularly difficult both to notice and to work on.
And that brings me to my point around it, which is I think that even as somebody has some awareness, as they're listening to you and your expertise, and they have some awareness and they see their behavior and maybe even see some of the downsides, see some of the destruction that it's doing. If it's identity based, it's very difficult. So what I mean by that is, yes, I know I'm a perfectionist, but that makes me a better worker. That makes me better at, that makes me do this. So the justification of this clinging to an identity. Do you have any recommendations, any insights to help somebody who's like maybe just on the sort of thin edge of recognizing that this is a behavioral addiction that I've got attached to my identity, that when people say, oh, he's a perfectionist or she's a perfectionist, it's kind of like a little bit of a glow around that one, a little bit of a, I'm such a good person. You know what I mean? Right. Exactly. Bit of share in there.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. There are multiple approaches that you could take with this at the cultural level in terms of company culture or at the individual level. I do it in the clinic at the individual level, but I also work with organizations at the cultural level. Really, that self-awareness is key, but they hold on to it as a source of pride. And I think the way to pry them from that, if you can, and you can't with everyone, is to let them know a couple of things. One, and I've mentioned this earlier, perfectionism and high expectations are not the same. So you can be as successful as you have been by having high expectations and ditching the perfectionism. And so I think people just want that safety net. They want to know that this thing that they think is so helpful for them, that's gotten them so far, is not something that they can get rid of, and then it would cause all of these problems in their life. In fact, they can actually thrive even more by getting rid of it. Sometimes they don't understand this. The other thing I might do, and this one's a little bit tricky, but it can work like a charm, is I use their perfectionism against them. And what I mean by that is work with a perfectionist to realize that their actual perfectionism is undermining their ability to become the best that they can be. If you want to be perfect, you got to ditch the perfectionism.
Perfect is the enemy of done.
Yeah, there's no bigger undermining of your quality of work than perfectionism in my mind. Yes, it can yield some great products, but the people who really struggle, their products take forever to get completed, or they're way too detailed oriented that they're missing the big picture, or they just never get done in the first place.
Is it, we're coming towards the end of part 1 of the show, but I want to ask you, is it possible, so people listening, is it possible to be a perfectionist in specific areas and completely slovenly, I'll use that term, in other areas, as in you really don't give a shit about some other things, but you're hyper-focused in other areas?
Yeah, I do think that that is a common presentation. We'll see people that have just this generalized perfectionistic approach to the world. And you'll see this in their work and in sports and in family life. It's more of a personality disposition, and it can be devastating for people, to the point where I'll see them in my clinic and provide cognitive behavior therapy for them. Sometimes they're even diagnosed with something like depression or obsessive compulsive disorder. Most people don't have that level of extreme perfectionism. They're not synonymous with a disorder. It's just a sort of a personality or a worldview. And then there are the people that you describe where they're really just stuck in an area where they have these unrealistic expectations and this value system around it, and then being unwilling to be flexible around it. And it might be in 1 or 2 areas of their life. And I wouldn't even say that those folks are easier to work with than the more generalized perfectionists. Sometimes they're so deep in the hole with one area that they're the hardest to get out.
The reason I brought that up as we come up to the end of part 1 here, the reason I brought that up is because if you're listening to this right now and you're thinking, well, yeah, I'm a bit of a perfectionist about this, but I'm not about that, so this isn't really talking about me. Hold on a minute. Pump the brakes, because it can be in a or several specific areas and not in others. And that is really a fascinating way to look at yourself. As you've heard me say many times in this podcast, you are not a single-faceted being. You are a diamond. There are multiple facets of you. And one of those, 2 of those, 3 of those facets might be perfectionistic, and the others might not give a crap. But don't let either of those sides be the determination of who you are. There's more to you than that. We're having this delicious conversation with Dr. Greg Chasson about perfectionism and about his beautiful book called Flawed, which I encourage you to go get. And I want to make sure that people know how they can find out more about you and about the book and about all of your resources. So please tell us more.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking, Dov. The book can be found at flawedbook.com, which I think is a bit of a fun URL for a book about perfectionism. Flawedbook.com. And you can learn more about me at gregchasson.com, Chasson as in Nancy. And there you'll get some other resources on perfectionism. You'll learn a little bit about programs that I might be able to offer your organizations. And I'm actually in the process of developing a community membership for people who want to develop more of a psych-mindedness approach and a wellness performance balance to their organization and to their professional approach to the world. And so that's forthcoming. I'm excited about that as well. But all of that will be available to learn more on my website.
Fabulous. And of course, we'll make sure that all of that is put in the show notes. So if for some reason you didn't hear it, or you didn't get a chance to write it down, or you're on the treadmill or the toilet or wherever you are listening to this podcast, you can go to the show notes and you'll find all of the links right in there. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with Dr. Greg Chasson, and we'll see you in one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.